This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. Today, we're going to be hearing about a very special Connecticut artist. Minnie Negoro was a world-class ceramics artist and professor who spent her life teaching at the University of Connecticut. This year, UConn is curating an exhibit to honor her work and her impact on the university. We'll hear about her journey from a Japanese concentration camp to a beloved UConn professor. But before we get to the show today, I need to take a moment to talk about something that may feel unrelated to today's show, but it is related, important, and urgent. Last week, Congress defunded public media. Connecticut Public lost 10% of its funding, and that adds up to more than $2 million. It's too soon to know what the full impact will be, but we do know there will be changes to what you listen to, read, and watch. Shows you enjoy, too, will be harder to make. News in rural communities will be harder to cover. And free and freely accessible programming you enjoy will be in jeopardy. It'll also make it harder to spotlight and produce conversations like the one we're having today. Whether you agree with Congress's decision or not doesn't matter right now. What does matter is that you're here listening. And that tells me you find something worthwhile about this show, and maybe about public radio in general. So if that's true, I ask you to donate. Connecticut Public needs monthly donors to help replace what we've lost and protect what you stand to lose. Congress made up its mind. Today, it's your turn to make up yours. If you like listening to Connecticut Public, if you depend on NPR news stories from across the country and the world, the best thing you can do today is to give. You can start a monthly donation at ctpublic.org/donate. And now back to the show. Joining us now is Hannah Maruyama. She's an assistant professor of Asian American Studies and Public History at the University of Connecticut. Thank you so much, Hannah, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And also with us is Denise Pelletier, who's a professor of art at Connecticut College, and she was Minnie's student and lifelong friend. Thank you so much, Denise, for spending time with us today as well.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Hannah, I want to start with you here. Could you describe who Minnie Negoro was and tell us more about her background?
So Minnie Negoro was a Japanese-American potter and a UConn professor. She was born in Montebello, California in the 1920s. She was about 22 years old, just finishing up her senior year when she was sent off to Japanese-American incarceration sites, specifically Pomona and then Heart Mountain, which is actually where my grandparents were incarcerated too. Or my grandmother. And she had this weird opportunity there to learn ceramics. They had this idea to launch a ceramics program that never really got off the ground. But she met Daniel Rhodes, an up-and-coming potter at that point, and got to leave Heart Mountain to go attend Alfred University, and then finished her master's in ceramics and went on to become a UConn ceramics professor for more than 20 years.
That's an amazing trajectory, and we're going to go into her experiences throughout the conversation today. But what do we know about her time in the Japanese incarceration camps?
She was with her parents, but she was separated from her older brother. We don't actually know all that much because she was pretty quiet about it. But we do know that she found the experience very alienating and isolating. She found it really hard, I think, to be both surrounded by that many people in such tight quarters and also, I think, felt really lonely. And so I think it was a really hard time for her. But she also met Daniel Rhodes. They left Heart Mountain for a couple of trips to go and collect clay from the surrounding area. So there's this one story of them going to Yellowstone National Park under armed guard, of course, to collect clay. We know that she taught ceramics eventually at Heart Mountain, and that she was paid $16 a month for that, which think about that nowadays.
Right.
You could buy a sandwich for that. But yeah, we don't actually know all that much. She got really good at throwing clay, but she never got to fire up any of her work because the ceramics unions in Congress kind of came after the program. And so eventually it got shut down. So she got really good at throwing clay, but none of her work from Heart Mountain actually exists today.
Well, and it seems really unusual, which I think makes this conversation so unique, was the fact that she was taking these classes while at the camps. Of course, because she met her mentor, but do you know how she got connected to ceramics in the first place, or ceramic classes in the first place?
Yeah, I think it was a really weird program. There was nothing like it at any of the other camps, as far as I know. Basically, Dylan Meyer and his team felt like it was really important to keep Japanese Americans busy. And so a lot of them, he wanted them to work in agriculture and irrigation, but they also had this reputation as being good potters. And so I think that's where that program came from. So they were supposed to eventually have this whole ceramics plant. They were going to create plates and bowls and cups for the Army and for the other centers. It was not supposed to be a commercial operation, even though the Ohio and New York ceramics lobbies kind of came after it because on the grounds that it was going to compete with them and that they were going to somehow bring that knowledge that they got in the US back to Japan, which was a place they had never been to. So yeah, it was a really kind of odd program and just very random.
Right. Definitely the first time learning about this, as we were looking into her story, it was just amazing to hear that this even existed. And even the fact that she's able to do this during what I imagine to be a very dark time in her life, and to want to pursue it further into her future life is pretty amazing to me. What made her decide to further pursue education in ceramics?
I think she was probably just really good at it. She had a little bit of experience. She worked for Laura Andresen, who was a potter at UCLA before the war. But I don't think she'd actually really thrown all that much before that. So she really credited Daniel Rhodes with kind of teaching her the wheel and showing her kind of the joy that it could bring. So I think she described it as the joy and tranquility of throwing in her retrospective. And she called him her sensei, which I think is so funny. But I think she also kind of got from Daniel Rhodes this encouragement to apply to Alfred, and you saw it as a way to get out of camp, but also was a very creative person generally and came from a creative family. Her mom made rugs at Heart Mountain. She had been knitting and costume designing and sewing and bookbinding, was really artistic even before the war, and was majoring in art. She was also minoring in economics to, I think, be practical, or maybe it was accounting, but she did really love art, I think, even before the war.
Well, and then she had time to throw and to be inspired by the joy and tranquility from it. Talk about her work and what made it so exceptional. What was she inspired by, and how did that start showing up in her art?
What I love about Minnie Negoro is, as a Japanese American myself, and I'm mixed race, so what I love about her is how she kind of explores these themes of identity and how complicated it can be when you've been punished for being Japanese American. And you see this gorgeous mid-century aesthetic that's really grounded in these like fine lines, these very neat designs, but you also see her kind of grappling with assumptions about what it means to be Japanese and the way that her work was being exotified. So she has these really gorgeous abstract lines that are very a signature of hers. And sometimes people will ask, like, oh, do they mean anything? And no, they don't actually mean anything. They're just abstract lines. So I think she's kind of playing around with these assumptions that we have. You definitely see Mingei aesthetics. She took classes with Bernard Leach while she was at Alfred, and he was credited with bringing Mingei aesthetics to the US. He was an English potter, so it was kind of, I think, a weird experience for her to be learning about Japanese aesthetics from an English potter. But I think it also really helped her grapple with the feelings of shame that she felt around being Japanese American, and kind of allowed her to express those tensions of identity in her work.
And do you think the fact that she, like many, was straddling between two cultures that added to the sort of the nuance of her work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And with that in mind too, it's so interesting to hear about how she first got connected to UConn. What can you tell us more about her work as a teacher and mentor for so many students over the years?
What made this exhibition such a joy to curate was how involved her students were in the program. She passed away in 1998, and more than 20 years later, her students just love her. They showed up to the exhibition. They helped out with research. I had someone reach out to me totally out of the blue with her old class notes, which was really fun to see. And so she was supposed to be like a really hard professor. She did not pull any punches. Her students were expected to learn clay chemistry. They were expected to learn glazes. These were typically considered graduate level work. And I've heard from multiple of her students that, they went off to Alfred after her. They followed in her footsteps to Alfred, and the professors there knew her. They knew her students. So she really had a reputation as a great teacher in ceramics.
Well, and I want to bring Denise here, Denise Pelletier, who's a professor of art at Connecticut College. Denise, you were Minnie's friend. Tell us about how that relationship, how that friendship became, and how you became friends.
Well, first, I was Minnie's student. And so I was her undergraduate student at UConn between 1975 and 1978. I graduated in 1978. And everything Hannah says about Minnie as a teacher is true, and then some. She was an exactingly tough teacher, but really supportive. You knew that she had your back, that she wanted excellence from you, and encouraged you to do that. So I consider her my mentor as well as friend, and I know that I wouldn't be the artist I am today without her guidance and her help. And that's a funny thing to say, because as a student, some of us were a little afraid of her. She could be rough.
Right. She sounds like she can be really intense.
Oh, yes. And and we called her Miss Negoro. There was no first name, or not even professor. She wanted to be known as Miss Negoro. So after I graduated in 78, I knew that she had a special interest in me. She encouraged me. I was a first generation college student. I think she really recognized that. I was also self-supporting. I was on my own at 18. I think that, and she knew that, never talked to me about it, but I always had this idea that she was rooting for me because I was doing it myself. And I had a job outside of school, no parental support, all that kind of stuff. And she was a very strong feminist. So I do think that was important to her. In retrospect, I didn't think it then. I was a college student. But after getting to know her as a friend afterwards, that became very clear to me. After I graduated, I got married very quickly, and I moved around the country a little bit, but then settled in Norwich, Connecticut, which was not very far from Mystic, where she lived. And she told me to keep in touch, and I did. And she was the one who, I was pregnant in 1979, and she called me one day out of the blue, and she said, "I know you're looking for a place to work. There's this little community center in Stonington, Connecticut, and they're looking for an instructor." And I was pregnant and everything, but they had a kiln and a wheel, and a couple of wheels, and I taught kids and adults a couple of days a week, and that was my start. And because it was in Stonington, and actually she had taught there before, I think that's was the germination of a long friendship, of her alerting me to opportunities when she knew that I didn't have a lot of financial means to get them.
Well, and when sort of the process between you being a student and becoming a friend, did you know what her background was? Did you know what she went through when you were a student, and how did that change the way you feel about, or if it did change the way you feel about her, both as a mentor, as a teacher, and as a friend?
I would say that my friendship with Minnie grew over many years. It grew slowly and organically over many years. For the first, I don't know, 10 years probably, I felt really that she was my teacher mentor. And I still called her Miss Negoro for quite a while, until one day at lunch at her house, she said, "You can call me Minnie." And it was just so, I was so overjoyed that she shared that. She was a private person. And through our conversations, I would bring my baby over there for lunch sometimes. And she was an avid gardener, and she would show me her flowers. And she had a beautiful A-frame home that she designed herself. So I spent many afternoons visiting with her. And it just grew organically like that. But she never talked about her background from the beginning, but very gradually she opened up little by little. I did hear, I certainly knew about Alfred. I certainly knew that she had worked at UCLA and with Laura Andreessen, and I knew all of that stuff. But she didn't tell me about Heart Mountain for quite a while. And then it totally clicked. I knew when she was born, and I knew some history. And I wondered a little, but I felt it was invasive to even ask. And I didn't ever ask, but she shared it with me privately over time. And I don't think, we certainly didn't know as students at UConn that she had gone through that.
And how did you first get introduced to ceramics? Where did Minnie fall into your ceramics journey?
I actually started college at Central Connecticut State University, and transferred quickly to UConn after studying. I mean, I was a student who was interested in history and anthropology and sociology, and I was always kind of the high school artist, but I wasn't sure what I was going to major in. But I went to Central, and I met Molly Bornstein, who was the ceramics instructor there. And Molly had studied with Minnie and had just graduated from UConn several years prior. And I don't know, I think she just recognized some talent in me, and she knew I was from that area. I was from Coventry. And she encouraged me to study with Minnie, even though it meant transferring out. And so I transferred to UConn to study with Minnie. And that was the reason. I think UConn was a better fit for me, larger university. It was just really a better fit. The Central, mostly because I grew up on the UConn campus, riding my bike there from 5 miles away. But I ended up at UConn really specifically to study with Minnie.
Well, I say Minnie earlier, and I realized maybe I should have said Miss Negoro, because now I'm thinking it's a little weird.
Oh,
the teacher authority, right? It never leaves you as a student.
yes.
Yeah. And you've also gone on to be a nationally known ceramics artist, and lots of your work very unique, very beautiful. Could you talk about what your work looks like today, and what has inspired you, and how Minnie/Miss Negoro shaped your work? Was her approach to ceramics as both a craft and an art influential for you?
Oh, for sure. I mean, my work changed a lot over the years, but I started, like all of my classmates at UConn, with the wheel as truly our center. And that's where kind of creativity sprang. And one thing that Minnie believed in, I think, is you can concentrate deeply in one area so that you know what deep inquiry feels like. And instead of having us be all over the place with let's try this and let's try that, she felt, and that was her strength too, that to start with the wheel and then somehow see how that constant can invigorate or inspire other ways of thinking. We all kind of started from that place. And so I have to start there, that my thesis work was generated, the forms were generated on the wheel, but altered quite a bit. And they responded a lot to natural, like nature and those sorts of things. I didn't know at the time that she was such an avid gardener. So I think she liked my work a lot because I was using nature as my inspiration. My other classmates too, everyone's work was extremely unique at the end, even though pretty much everybody used the wheel as the place. So when I got out of school, I envisioned myself as a potter. And this idea about function was really important, that something would be useful and that a craft in the 70s and certainly prior, craft work was considered secondary to fine art. And she knew that that was there, but did not believe in it, and instilled in us the importance of craft in a kind of cross-cultural and time-based art form. So I think that I brought that forward. But I was a potter for a while, and I started. I guess I made hand-built pots as well as wheel-thrown pots for quite a while. I wanted to go to graduate school, but I had two kids, and I had to figure that out. So.
Right. Well, there's so much to ceramics, I think, than a lot of us imagine, certainly than I have imagined. And it's amazing listening to you describe your process. I can feel the clay in my fingers right now. And then before we go to break, I do want to bring Hannah back in just to respond to this idea of Minnie's approach to ceramics as both a craft and an art.
Yeah, I see that absolutely in her art. And I would say, to Denise's earlier points, I also think she was learning from her students a lot too. You see in the exhibition, you see some of her collaborations with her students. And there's some of Denise's work, both more recent, but also from her time in college. And I really see kind of a cross message happening between Denise and Walter and Minnie throughout her work. One of the things that one of her students said to me when she was starting off, when she was going through the exhibition, was you just want to cradle her work in your hands. And to me, that really spoke to the beauty of craft. Craft is what you see in your day-to-day life. It's what makes your life beautiful. And it's the coffee cup that you will carry that fits your hand perfectly. It's the beauty of that cup. It's the vase that you keep your flowers in. It's the stuff that you surround yourself with, right? And I think coming from Japanese American incarceration camps, having lost a lot of their belongings and having had to make beauty for themselves behind barbed wire in really small barracks, craft played a significant role in their experiences at Heart Mountain. If they didn't make beautiful things, they just had a very kind of dreary, arid landscape to look out at, and very bare bones barracks. Craft could also make their lives much more livable. Those rugs could help keep out the dust. It could help insulate during the winter, right? So craft is, to me, I think curating this exhibition has really shown me the beauty of function and craft.
Well, I'm really glad that Minnie was able to do that so we can have this conversation today. You've been listening to Hannah Maruyama, who's an assistant professor of Asian American Studies and Public History at UConn. And also with us is Denise Pelletier, who's a professor of art at Connecticut College, and she was Minnie's student and lifelong friend. They'll stay with us for the hour, and if you're a ceramics artist or knew Minnie or her work, we would love to hear from you. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Minnie Negoro first learned ceramics while imprisoned in a Japanese concentration camp. She went on to be a beloved artist and teacher at the University of Connecticut. Joining us now is Jason Oliver Chang. He's an associate professor of history and Asian American studies and also department head of social and critical inquiry. Jason, welcome back to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here.
And still with us is Hannah Maruyama from UConn and Denise Pelletier, professor of art at Connecticut College. So, Jason, you were listening to the conversation earlier. You're also familiar with Minnie's story and work. Anything that you want to respond to?
Yes, this is such a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Hannah and Denise. I think it's worth pointing out that, for my whole time since beginning at UConn in 2011, I had never heard of Minnie Negoro. And I first learned about her at a conference at Northeastern University. And the presenter came to me afterwards and said, you ought to be interested in Minnie. She started the ceramics program at UConn. And I thought, this is so strange to be working at UConn in Asian American studies and doing local work and not even knowing about Minnie. So I feel like this work of recovering her place in UConn's history is just so fantastic. And just listening to the conversation, it makes me really appreciate having the expertise of Professor Hannah Maruyama, who can do this kind of detailed historical work to really find out the congressional dialogue that happened around the ceramics programs for the incarceration camps during World War II. I can't think of very many other historians who could actually figure that out. And so having these kinds of opportunities to bring community together, to reconstruct important pasts is just fantastic work because it allows for us to create community. And telling these stories is an important part of reflecting on the significance of these kinds of programs at UConn and the fact that they were created by someone with such a challenging story.
Well, I think like many conversations we've been having too is learning about things that we had no idea that existed. As you say, Minnie Negoro is one of many important stories that's been unearthed recently of the AAPI community here in Connecticut. And so this school year is the first year that students will be required to take a course in AAPI studies. Could you remind our listeners what that class might look like?
Yeah, so the state has a statute now that includes the teaching of Asian American and Pacific Islander studies in K through 12 education, public education, and that can look like a lot of different things. It will look very different in kindergarten than it will in high school. But we've been working to develop lesson plans, model curriculum, and also helping to do professional development for teachers in the state. Earlier last year, we were able to do a professional development class for teachers who teach the early college experience Intro to Asian American Studies course, which is a dual credit UConn and high school class. And the teachers spent their time at the exhibit, learning about Minnie's story and finding out how to teach immersive Asian American studies. The kinds of work that is presented in the exhibit really helps to detail how national stories can have a local significance, and so by doing these, by creating sort of these detailed examples of what Asian American studies looks like in Connecticut, it really shines the light on the other work that we need to do to tell other communities' stories, and so that will look really different in different districts because Asian Americans are a really diverse group. Pacific Islanders are a very diverse group, and so doing something that is sort of what I would consider like mainstream Asian American studies that focuses on East Asians won't always meet communities' needs, right? Because Connecticut's predominant Asian American communities are South Asian. We have a significant Southeast Asian refugee community, and the community keeps on growing, and so the curriculum ought to reflect that. And so we really see things like this exhibit, one drawing on submerged histories, to then welcome other folks to tell their stories, so that we're not playing catch up.
Well, I want to get into more details about incorporating Connecticut history into the curriculum. But Hannah, I'm seeing you nodding a lot here. I would love for you to respond, especially talking about, we have a lot of history that's been submerged, but now they're emerging. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just so grateful that Jason fought to get this legislation passed. I feel like we're really seeing the importance of this legislation right now. And the Asian American and Pacific Islander histories are mandated as part of the Connecticut curriculum is a really important way of validating their significance. When I was in high school, I think I got maybe 1 hour on Japanese American incarceration. And it was mostly taught by someone who clearly didn't know anything, because at 14, I remember thinking that's just not right. Which I was not an expert on that history at 14 either. So, I think the more that we can have students' lives and experiences reflected in their education, the more engaged they're going to be as students, and the more excited they're going to be about learning history.
Well, and I think the really cool thing about the curriculum too is incorporating the local history, as you mentioned, Jason, having that local angle with a lot of the national stories. And I think Minnie's story in particular is amazing because she has both of those angles, especially for Connecticut. So just using Minnie as an example, how would you incorporate Connecticut history into the curriculum? Obviously a broad question because it's K through 12. But.
Right. Well, I think, since Asian American Studies is an interdisciplinary field, Minnie's story offers so many different access points. It could be taught as an art lesson. It could be taught as a history lesson. And it could be taught, we could look at comparing ceramics artists in the Northeast. You could do, as Hannah has described, a sort of art history approach by looking at the influences that have shaped aesthetics, and I think those kinds of lessons help to expand what students are exposed to, and like what Denise had said about really understanding what deep inquiry is, I think is a really important kind of pedagogical approach, because project-based learning and case studies really allow students to see the richness and the depth of any particular subject. And oftentimes teachers will go to those subjects that have the most depth in the source material, in the evidence available to them. And those are the most well-documented cases, which aren't always, representative of Connecticut's residents. And so when we have the opportunity to develop a really rich, engaging story, it provides that opportunity for students to really dive in.
Well, you're reading my mind, Jason, because I was just thinking about what Denise was saying too, explaining the deep inquiry. And I'm actually imagining myself at the wheel with my hands in the clay doing some thinking. So I might have to do that after the show today. But Denise, I wanted to throw this question to you, completely pun not intended. How do you incorporate history into your ceramics class? Because I'm just having a moment here that it's more than just making whatever end product you want to make with that piece of clay. It's learning about history. It's learning about learning, it sounds like.
In my teaching, over many, you get to be a better teacher after teaching many years, and you learn a lot of things. And one of the things that I incorporate is I always show students lots of images and with a little bit of context, but really cross-culturally and throughout time. And so they can see connections between cultures, and they can see connections between practices, but also what is very unique to a particular group of people and time. And I think that kind of inquiry is really helpful because they don't get it. They don't get the kind of art history through craft, and they don't get it through material studies. And so because there are many cultures today that don't have the same kind of I don't know, like art systems that we have in kind of contemporary art. Art is part of life, and the value systems are different as well. So I think that that's really, really important that I talk about in my classes as a forefront, as a way of understanding why people make what they make, and who is it for. And and I think that those kinds of contexts are very important. American students tend to see what's in the museum. They read about mythology.
Right. Well, and it's interesting learning about, students can learn about art history through craft. And I think many of us also try to learn art history through going to museums and looking at exhibits. So I want to toss this question to Hannah. How have you incorporated the history of the Japanese concentration camps into Minnie's exhibit?
Yeah, we didn't want this exhibition to be just an art exhibition. Not that there's anything wrong with an art exhibition. Right. She did already have a retrospective at the Benton in 1992. And so we didn't want to replicate her own past work. Instead, we felt that there was something significant about the historical context, and that far from diminishing the significance of her work, it actually really emphasized the hurdles that she had to overcome to get to where she could be the phenomenal artist that she was. I think there's also really important gender dynamics in appreciation of craft versus art, and who has access to being called an artist and being recognized that way versus whose work frequently gets just diminished as craft, right? I also just think, so to Jason's earlier point, I would love to see a science class on ceramics. I the whole time I was teaching because I did actually start out teaching students with this exhibition project in mind, and they worked on early drafts of this content. But one thing that we were talking about was how much we would have liked to learn science in a way that was creative and that encouraged us to think about science and chemistry as hands-on in that way. I think that's just, to me, Minnie taught me how to be a teacher too. I think after the pandemic, I was really struggling to figure out how to balance care for our students with high expectations. And she really reminded me that high expectations for our students is also a form of care, that expecting them to do their best is actually really important for them in their learning process.
Well, I love this thread too. We're talking about students learning about art history through craft. You can also learn about chemistry through art, right? How did the clay, I'm having these images here, how did it form that way? It'll be really cool, and I think have a different appreciation for that piece of art if you knew the science behind it. And before we go to break, I do want to ask Jason quickly here, because we're talking about different ways of learning about history and culture, because in addition to establishing the curriculum, you've also been working on a really cool project, teaching students to interview their families and document, archive, and record oral histories. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've been working with the Greenwich Historical Society and the India Cultural Center down in Koskab, and it started as a project that the India Cultural Center wanted to do a youth-centered summer program. And I suggested that doing an oral history project that engaged students with their families could be really valuable. And now we're in our fourth year. Now we have funding from CT Humanities, and it's just amazing to see the kind of transformation that students go through when they become the family historian. And so this project is called My Story, Our Future. You can find it on Spotify, and dozens of middle school and high school South Asian American students have interviewed their parents and grandparents about their immigration stories, their life in Connecticut. And I think it's just sort of synonymous with this, sort of recovery of Minnie's story and the kinds of lives that that people live are important to them, and to see them recognized by others is just a form of validation that I think is sort of uncommon for Asian American youth. And so these kinds of projects that are about sharing stories, that spotlighting the contributions that communities have made, and how they've sparked community, how they've connected to other people is just one of the hallmarks of, I think, this work of recovery, recuperation, and joy.
You've been listening to Jason Oliver Chang, who is an associate professor of history and Asian American studies and department head of social and critical inquiry at UConn, Denise Pelletier, professor of art at Connecticut College, and Hannah Maruyama, who's an assistant professor of Asian American studies and public history at UConn. For our listeners, let us know if you're a ceramics artist or if you knew Minnie's work. We would love to hear from you. 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we've been talking about Connecticut artist and professor Minnie Negoro. The University of Connecticut is exhibiting her work to celebrate her life and legacy. Denise, I want to jump straight back to you here because currently we live in a world of mass production and artificial intelligence influencing art. What is it like teaching in a world where so much of art is manufactured? How do you continue to instill a love for this craft in your students?
Well, one thing is certain, they still want to work with their hands. And in some ways, even more so. I don't think that there's in a way a false dichotomy that somehow one cancels out the other. I think, and I honestly think that Minnie would think that too, almost to be celebrating the handmade even more. Because we have fewer and fewer, and certainly young people have fewer and fewer opportunities to engage their bodies in learning. And they don't even write anymore. They tap it out on their phone or on their computer. And so this kind of deep engagement with especially this material clay, where all you do is squeeze it and it tells you were there. It's the imprint of your hand. And there's something really existential about it. I think that there's a joy in it. Ceramics classes and opportunities to make craft across the country are just exploding because of this deep need, I think, this human need to create and also to engage your body in that kind of creation. So even though technology is there, we can also think about technology as, I'm going to kind of circle back to something that Hannah was saying, and Jason too, about materials and learning about geology and learning about material science and all that. That's technology. And kilns are technology. Fire is technology. A potter's wheel was one of the first technological inventions in the history of people. And so I like to teach technology in terms of this inclusive way and very broad way of thinking about what that means, and that technology is an adjunct to the human body.
Well, I love the blend of the two because I think many things are sort of a mix of our own physical labor and technology. And the technology doesn't have to be digital, right? There's all kinds of technology like you described, Denise. Hannah, curious to hear your thoughts about what Denise just shared, and is that present in Minnie's philosophy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, her first assignment for students, and Denise, you can correct me on this, but it was basically you had to throw a straight cylinder, which I came into this project knowing very little about the ceramic side of things. So I actually took a ceramics class in preparation. I called it my research, part of my research for the project. And I think just like the embodied feel knowledge that you get from ceramics is really important. When you're learning to throw, you don't have a sense of how you should be throwing stuff, but over time you develop this feel for it, and it's not something that you can kind of convey in words, but when you feel it, you know it. And I think that's a kind of knowledge that we don't encourage students to experience very much, but it's actually, I think, really important. It's how we form habits, right? So that learning for feel is something that I really got out of ceramics, and that you can use your hands as tools. There's this beautiful photo of her hands in the exhibition that just shows her kind of throwing, and that your hands are something that can help you build and create. I think is something that really comes through in her teaching.
So we might only have time for one more question, but I do want to get a question from Catherine, who shared with us on Facebook. And I'm going to throw this out for Denise. If Minnie were here today, what do you think she would say to current younger artists?
That's a great question. She would say some of the stuff that she always said to us, because I think it was really deeply believed by her, and that is to work hard and be focused. Don't get discouraged, but also follow your own path, that you absorb all of this knowledge from the world, but your joy and your goal is to follow your own path and to see how that creativity blossoms in a way for you as an individual. Like, she always encouraged us at that time to find your own way. And also, like, we had to make our own glazes and everything had to be yours, like that you had to really do it yourself. And I think that she would still say that today. And I think that she would also remind everyone that that nothing is forever, and it's up to you to keep knowledge alive and to keep an inquiry and a way of working alive. So I think that she would not think that technology or these other aspects of learning negate what we do, but that you have a responsibility as an individual.
Well, thank you so much for that question, Catherine. 30 seconds. Jason, last question here. What do you hope people get out from the exhibit?
Oh, wow. Yes. I mean, I think there's this enduring story of how Minnie shaped her own story. How she is, as Denise is saying, that she, the lessons that she's imparting on her students are ones that she put into practice, and that, you know, through this, through her art, through her craft, she was able to not only make a life for herself, but make a community, and that's really a powerful message.
Jason Oliver Chang, Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies from UConn. Thank you so much, Jason, for being with us today. You're also listening to Denise Pelletier from Connecticut College. Denise, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And also Hannah Maruyama, who's an Assistant Professor of Asian American Studies and Public History at UConn. Hannah, we really appreciate your time as well.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.